Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. Really excited to be seeing all the other folks in the Democracy Group in May. We'll be in DC together in person. It's so exciting. We are a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm really excited to be sharing video on there over the last few months. And of course, remember those reviews. We have links in the show notes to make all of this stuff easy to do. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with David French. David French graduated from Harvard Law. We're so happy to have him back on the program. David practiced as a commercial litigator and had switched to constitutional law. In 2006, David joined the JAG Corps as an Army lawyer and served with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, earning a Bronze Star for his service. Overall, David spent most of his career defending free speech, religious freedom, and due process in courtrooms across the country. Then over the last 10 years, David's focused on writing for publications such as National Review, The Dispatch, one of our favorites, The Atlantic, another one of our favorites, and has now been with the New York Times since 2023. I'm also a huge fan of his 2020 book, Divided We Fall, which we might actually get into a little bit today. In that book, David outlined the dangers of polarization and the need to engage with people who have opposing viewpoints, which continues to be a focus of his writing and all his work. David, thanks so much for joining and coming back on the show. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. You know, I wanted to start because last time we talked toward the middle of last year, you and Nancy were still going through it. So I should tell you up front, just, you know, got to confess, you're only the second most popular French on our show.
Clearly Nancy is the most popular French, as
Absolutely.
She should be. Yeah.
Well, how's Nancy doing? How's she coming along?
She's doing really well. She's completely cancer-free, which
Great.
is, thank God for that. And she's, it's tough to put a percentage on it, but 95% sort of like back physically, with stamina. And yeah, so she's doing so much better at this point than we were told to expect and that we expected. And so we're just incredibly grateful, completely cancer-free. 2024 was a nightmare of a year. Just, I have a whole new appreciation for the term cancer survivor, because it's not just a matter of living through the disease, it's a matter of living through the treatment. And the treatment was just incredibly rough, but it worked. It worked. And she's cancer-free, and we're incredibly grateful.
Well, thank goodness for that. I had my dad, we were certainly praying for you and the family, Nancy, and but I had my dad doing what's called a mishaberach. He goes to Chabad and doing, prayer for the sick for Nancy as well.
So wonderful. Thank you.
We were all praying for you. I did have a personal question for you. How do you get through as a husband, as a dad? Each day has to be another challenge for you. What are some of the ways that you got through it?
Well, when you're in the middle of it, you just do it. It's just one step at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time. You don't think too much about sort of how much is in front of you.
Yeah.
You just focus on the moment. What has to be done today? And I think, I know for me, it didn't really fully sink into me what 2024 was until after 2024 was over. Because, all of a sudden, becoming a caretaker and trying to step up in all other areas, it just becomes your daily life. It just becomes, everything changes, and it becomes the new normal. And so when you're in the middle of it, you often don't even think of it as anything other than this is what we do now, right? And so I think there's just kind of a way in which you just immediately reorder the priorities in your life. You say, okay, everything has changed now, and our absolute family focus is on helping Nancy as much as we possibly can. And it's just sort of reorients everything, and that just becomes, your daily life. And, I will say this, It was horrible. It was horrible, horrible. But at the end of the year, I think we as a family are a better family in many ways after enduring that all together. I
Yeah.
would never wish it. I would not wish it on my worst enemy. It was horrible. And I mean, horrible for Nancy above everybody, ever above everybody else. But there is something about pulling together to care for each other that just really binds a family together.
Mm. That's a great perspective. And to your point, you don't wish it on your worst enemy, but if heaven forbid, we go through it, I'd like to think that I could step up to the plate in that
Yeah.
regard.
You know,
That I,
my son gave up his last semester of in-person, school in college to come home and help.
oh wow,
And like without him doing that, it would have been so much more difficult, so much more
mm,
difficult. You know, that was a loss for him to sort of say, my last semester of college is I'm not going to be with my friends, I'm not going to be on campus. But again, that pulling together, that binding together of the family, I think was a truly beautiful thing.
yeah. So family connections, friend connections. It's a loose connection to what I was going to ask you about next, which is it seems like a lot of friends that I have seem to be going through a trauma, seem to be, half the country, the last election didn't, at least at the presidential level, didn't turn out the way they wanted. And part of the challenge, it seems like, isn't just what's actually happened, because now after post inauguration, even more has happened. But part of the challenge is not getting too far ahead of it and not, kind of in your imagination living out the
Yeah.
worst case scenarios, which there are numerous. How do you handle what's already happened without without tripping out about, all the worst case scenarios?
Yeah, I think what you have to do is you just have to be careful. Okay? So you can say you can see the direction the train is heading, for example,
Yeah.
and you can say the train is heading in a bad direction, but you don't necessarily know where the ultimate destination is.
Right.
So for example, we'll have all these fights over whether or not we're going to use the term fascism,
Hmm.
or fights like whether or not we're going to use the term constitutional crisis. Are we in a when are we in a constitutional crisis? And so sometimes we kind of get sidetracked by talking about what is the ultimate potential bad destination here, and lose sight of, wait, just on its own terms, whatever words you want to use, constitutional crisis, constitutional revolution, whatever words you want to use, what is happening now is not normal, and it's very destructive to our constitutional order. I don't have to go all the way to say fascism. I don't have to go all the way to say that we're at a constitutional crisis yet. And in fact, those kinds of words and that kind of discussion often sidetracks us from what's actually happening, because you get into a debate about, well, what is fascism? What is a constitutional crisis? I would like to just keep the focus on what is happening. And
Mm,
what is happening is a power grab by a president that is deeply disruptive to the constitutional order. What is happening is the government exercising is essentially engaged in malicious actions against political opponents, and it is engaged in malicious actions against civil servants, and it has switched sides. Our government has switched sides, in essence, in the Ukraine war. And I mean, this is just a partial summary,
right.
right? It's a partial summary. And so I think by saying that, by just focusing in on what has been done, then you can avoid a lot of these sort of meta arguments and really drill down and keep the focus where the focus should be, which is, are the Trump administration's actions destructive or not destructive? Which
Yeah.
is a different thing than, are we going to argue about like Trump in the historical definition of fascism, or Trump in the historical definition of a constitutional crisis? No, 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 no. Is what's happening now destructive or not? Let's just put it in those terms.
Well, I certainly want to ask you about specific actions the Trump administration's already taken and ways to understand them contextually. But before we move on from the other subject I just asked you about, I do want to ask you if there are other daily practices that you have. For example, what are you reading or what are you listening to on a daily basis in order to stay focused, to your point,
Oh gosh.
on what's real, as opposed to the reality TV distractions that come at us like a fire hose every day?
I almost am afraid for you to ask me that because I do not want anyone to imitate me because it's not good for your mental
Well,
health.
there's the whole
Okay.
Star Trek and Dune, like there's all
Yeah.
that stuff,
Well,
right?
let me put it like this. So, I was asked the other day, what hours do you work? Like, in other words, okay, what you're working? And I said, that's a very strange question because it's more, you should probably more ask, when are you disengaged?
Right,
Like when are you fully disengaged? And the answer is not very much.
right. I was going to
So
add if you take any breaks because
yeah. Now, we Nancy and I have a ritual. Like I work out, but when I work out, I'm listening to podcasts.
right,
We, but I would say the times when we really disengage are when the Lakers are on, when the Grizzlies are on. We have shows that we stream every night. That so we try to have kind of a wind down period every night.
Mm,
But in except for those times, I'm kind of just always plugged in.
right.
I'm either, reading news updates that you're getting from the Times, from the Post, etc., reading the longer form arguments from my colleagues at the Times, the Atlantic, National Review, etc., across the spectrum, monitoring what's happening on social media. I mean, as I walk through this, Corey, I'm like, don't be like me, guys. Don't be like me because but this is my job, right? This is
Sure.
my job. I'm talking to people who are sort of players in the various political and cultural and religious arenas. So, you know, it is. I would say the way that I keep up with things is a combination of the same sources that everyone else uses. The media outlets that everyone else uses, plus the personal relationships and the personal connections I have within the government, within the legal system, within the religious community, who provide me much more deeper background. And so it's kind of a process, Corey, of just constant engagement. And I do that so you don't have to.
Right. Well, okay, so picking up on that last point, to what degree, if any, do you consume some of the stuff that guys like Matt Walsh is putting out there, Dan Bongino was putting out there? Or are you specifically looking for because I know you have a great you have a great tendency to the other day you said I'm going to sane wash it
Yeah,
what
yeah,
the
yeah.
because it's clear that you do absorb opposing viewpoints. Are you specifically looking for say the Ross Douthat's, for example, or do you get enough opposing viewpoints from closer colleagues, say Russell Moore, Curtis Chang, or are you taking in the Mark Levins of the world?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, I read everything Ross writes just because he's brilliant, and he's just very, very good. So I read everything my colleague Ross Douthat writes. He's fantastic, one of the absolute best. But I don't look at Ross as like an opponent. The Venn diagram of our positions, there's a giant amount of overlap.
Sure.
He's more populist than I am. Uh, but there's a lot of overlap on a lot of deep things with Ross and with a lot of my other colleagues who are maybe to my left or, they're it, it, people are complicated and sometimes what gets highlighted in any given political moment is maybe an area of disagreement or sometimes it's areas of agreement. But I think that we need to kind of look at ourselves as sort of rather than, opponent or ally, we're just complicated people who overlap in some ways and don't in others. But to go to your core question, I consume lots of MAGA content, and there are two reasons for it. One is if I didn't, I couldn't do my job. I need to know what Dan Bongino, Mark Levin, Charlie Kirk, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and others are saying. I need to know this stuff. It's, manosphere influencers, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan. I can't consume all of the content. I would have no life, and I still need to watch I need to watch my Grizzlies and Severance. But yeah, I absolutely. And then the other thing is, I live in MAGA America. My neighborhood
Right.
is 85% Republican. I cannot live my life without hearing the MAGA perspective. Where I
Right.
live, I hear the MAGA perspective constantly and I have to actually seek out more liberal perspectives.
Mm.
So it's easy. It's actually easy for me to get the MAGA perspective because that's just the air I breathe and the water in which I swim. But I go beyond sort of my community and I read all the MAGA influencers and I monitor what they do. So I'm very, very familiar with MAGA culture, MAGA arguments. And I think that's one reason why people read me at the Times is because I can explain MAGA to them in ways that they can understand. Whereas if you kind of dip your toe into various elements, it all can seem confusing and opaque because there kind of is a MAGA like extended universe of belief systems and presuppositions and all of this that if you don't know, if you're not aware of, it's mystifying. And I would say this, it's just as mystifying to somebody on the left to look at MAGA as it is if somebody on the right goes to like a Brooklyn Democratic Socialists of America meeting.
Right.
Like the lingo, the beefs, the disputes, the resentments, all of this are opaque often to outsiders, but second nature to insiders. And I think that having that knowledge of where MAGA stands on these things is so critical. Otherwise, you just can't make sense of the news. You can't make sense of why. Why would Trump be turning on Ukraine? Well,
Yeah.
you have to know sort of the MAGA extended universe where Ukraine fits into their worldview.
So I'm curious. You do live in Red America, and are having conversations with folks you go to church with, your neighbors. One of the and I also try to listen to enough from broadcast personalities like Hannity to some of the more podcast guys, the Matt Walshes of the world. Part of it is because I want to see if there's something I haven't considered that I need to think through, but partly because I'm friends with guys from church as well who
Yeah.
are fully ensconced in MAGA. But you brought up, I think it was a piece that you put out about a month ago, and it picked up on something Catherine Stewart wrote about a little bit more extensively in her recent book, Money, Lies, and God. And it was, is it Carl Schmitt was the political
Yeah.
philosopher from the 30s. So
Friend enemy. Yep.
yeah, so that's a schism that I'm having trouble holding these conversations because I'm coming at it. You said we're all complicated. We're all human beings, but I'm speaking oftentimes with someone who, whether they would articulate it that way or not, see through much more of a friend enemy paradigm. How do you overcome a schism like that?
It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult because what's happening is you're running up against a process of acculturation that is extremely difficult to escape.
Mm.
And here's how I've described it to people. I would say I was recently speaking to a group and I
Oh,
said,
with the Mona Charon's panel where you were talking about 40
yes,
years of acculturation, right?
yes. And I was talking about and I was asking, did you grow up in a church that was a fight the world church or a church that was a love your neighbor
Oh,
church?
okay.
Okay. And so millions upon millions upon millions of Christians have grown up in what you would call a fight the world church,
Mm.
which now I'm not saying that fight the world churches do no love your neighbor and that love your neighbor churches never have to fight the world, so to speak. But I'm talking about the emphasis, the core emphasis. And I grew up in a sort of fundamentalist fight the world worldview where everything was out to get Christians. Like the people out there are just coming for us. They want to take our freedoms. They mock our values. And look, I know Christians faithful Christians are always going to be out of step in some way. Like, if you are a faithful Christian, no matter where you live, what period of history, what culture, etc., you're going to be countercultural to some extent. There's just no question about that.
Right.
But in essence, what the fight the world mindset said is all of this is against you. All of this is against you. Prepare for the persecution. Prepare for the scorn. Prepare for the coming terrible days. And so it puts you in kind of this permanent fight or flight posture where you're just alert for the danger. I talk about it like growing up in youth group, the world is coming after you and you're getting ready for the persecution, and somebody offers you a beer and you say no, and they go, come on, man. And you're like, oh, there it is. There's the persecution.
The persecution, yeah.
And so when you're raised in that mindset, you can slide into that friend-enemy morality so easily. It's like fitting your hand into the perfect glove, because that's what you've been taught. You've been taught that in the church is your community. Those people out there, they despise you. They want you. They wish you ill. And so that mindset puts you into this kind of fight or flight and makes you very receptive to fear-based political messaging. So when the fight the world Christians encountered Trump, who was the kind of ultimate political pugilist, like was calling out to like. There was a cultural match there, even though there wasn't a religious match. They had a cultural match. And whereas the love your neighbor Christian, which is the person who's raised to see your neighbors not as opponents, but as people created in the image of God to be loved, then in that circumstance, if you've come up in that tradition, that Trumpian approach is an absolute anathema. It's an absolute anathema. And for me personally, I was raised in that kind of fight, not at home. At home, I was raised love your neighbor. In church, I was raised fight the world. And then I got to law school, joined a Christian fellowship that was a love your neighbor Christian fellowship. And that really cemented in me that distinction. And I think that's one of the reasons why when Trump rose, I was repulsed by him early on as anyone who could be anything like a standard bearer for Christian political engagement, because I had been fundamentally changed by my family, by my Christian fellowship into the love your neighbor posture more than the fight the world posture. Right. That's a long answer to your question.
No. It's helpful. I guess I do want to ask you. I want to revisit "Divided We Fall." In that book, you outlined 4 major conditions at work that led to secession, and you came to very different conclusions because the book came out pre-January 6, 2021. It came out in 2020. Yeah. So those 4 conditions, and I'm oversimplifying here, but large and geographically contiguous region, culturally homogenous, its culture and essential that region's culture and essential liberties were under threat, and that region is consumed. At that point, you said an unreasonable fear of violence, but I think it's a lot less unreasonable now. Yeah. How is your assessment of that possibility today compared to when you wrote the book 5 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are, in many ways, I think objectively more divided than we were when I wrote the book. In the sense that when I wrote the book, there was an enormous amount of partisan animosity. But as I was writing it, it was before the George Floyd murder and the riots that followed. It was before the division around COVID. It was before January 6th. And I remember I was doing the final work on the book as COVID was really coming down. And I thought, well, this is going to test my thesis, because my thesis is that we're so divided that even a common crisis won't unite us the way it used to. And COVID did not unite us. Oh my gosh.
No.
And so what I would say right now is we're more divided, but also we're more demoralized. So the amount of division in America is profound and deep. We're not coming together as a country. I mean, we just had yet another election where the difference in the popular vote was like 1%. I mean, how closely divided can you get? I mean, we're very closely divided. But unlike 2017 and unlike MAGA in 2021, the losing side seems less energized than it is demoralized. So if you remember in 2017,
Oh,
you
yeah.
immediately had the resistance, right?
Right.
You had the Million Women March, and you immediately had this just giant galvanized resistance to Donald Trump. In 2021, we had this giant resistance that arose immediately after Joe Biden won, that culminated in an attack on the Capitol. In 2025, by contrast, the Democrats are demoralized. They feel defeated. There isn't sort of any kind of unified approach. So,
We do have paddles with messages on them.
yeah, you can pink clothing, whatever. So they're divided. They're demoralized. They don't have an approach. The only people who really seem to know what they're doing in opposing Trump are the lawyers. The lawyers are
Right.
being quite effective. And so it is very interesting. And one thing that I did not anticipate was that you could have greater division, but it could not be as dangerous in the short term because the division, one side is just demoralized. One side is just kind of at a loss, right? And so an actual division of the country, secession, would take one side saying, I'm not demoralized, I'm fed up, I'm out, I hate you that much. And I think the Democrats are going to get over their demoralization sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And then we'll see what happens. But right now, the dynamic, in my years following politics, I've never quite seen anything like this, the way in which the Democratic Party has just, I'm kind of surprised how surprised they seem to be. Like, I would say in the entire election season in 2024, there was maybe 72 hours that I thought Kamala Harris was going to win.
Really?
Yeah. The rest of it, I was pretty darn sure Trump was winning this thing. And so, when you look at the Democrats and they just seem gobsmacked, I'm like,
Yeah.
guys, where you been? The whole 24 election season, Trump was polling better than he did in any time before in 2016 or 2020. So why are we shocked here?
Right.
Why is this
Right.
surprising?
Yeah, I had seen some of the warning signs. In particular, I follow Mike Madrid's work pretty closely. And the significant warning sign, his specialty is Latino politics, Latino voters. So I've seen some of those warning signs, but even Mike seemed overall optimistic that Kamala would win. So maybe it was my own confirmation bias that I was following certain analysts that were leaning. They said it was a tight race, but leaning in Kamala's direction nonetheless. And then, looking at the Kamala Trump debate and that Madison Square Garden rally and certain signs, I was just looking for those signs and thinking, yeah, this time the polls are closer, but the best polls have all accounted for certain factors that hadn't been worked into their calculations in previous cycles. So I was pretty gobsmacked, admittedly.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. I get that. I think I was listening to a lot of the same commentators, and
Yeah,
the reason why I wasn't buying as much what they were selling is that I knew the core of Trump's base. I mean, not the core of Trump's base. The core Trump base might have been all in on the Madison Square Garden rally, like
yeah,
his primary voters. But the big bulk of voters who are going to vote for him to put him over the top, I encounter them every day in my life.
right.
They don't know any of this stuff. They don't know what happened at Madison Square Garden. They don't know. This is something that I wish that like politically interested people, like people who listen to podcasts, would understand. Giant numbers of Americans have only the most basic idea of who Donald Trump is and what he's done.
Mm.
I mean, and that sounds weird to say, but it's true. It is true, especially if they're right leaning, because if they're right leaning, they're disproportionately likely to pay attention to right wing media only or exclusively or mainly. And if you watch right-wing media, as we talked that we do, when was the last time you heard an actual critique of Donald Trump? It is 100% defenses. It is 100% dedicated to debunking any attack against him. So the weird dynamic here, Corey, is every new scandal, oddly enough, binds his base closer to him because they view every attack as automatically illegitimate, as automatically another example of persecution, because they don't dive into the details. They're just familiar with the defenses. So it'd be like imagine you're following the fight between a U.S. attorney and a mafia boss, but the only people you ever listen to are the defense attorneys.
Right.
That's the only people you ever listen to. Well, you're going to come away from that viewing John Gotti as a poor, persecuted, victim of a overpowering deep state, right?
Right.
And so this is what's happening is you've got millions upon millions upon millions of people who either don't pay attention to politics at all who are voting, and the people who don't pay attention to politics at all voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And then you add to that the millions of people who do pay attention to politics, but only through the prism of their partisan media. And then you wonder why, like Trump scandals don't move the needle. They either don't know about them or they've exposed to this scandal exclusively through the lens of defending Trump.
Yeah. So I became a Christian in 2000, and I couldn't have articulated it back then. But I walked into a fundamentalist Baptist church and was ensconced in this new community. I was on fire for the Lord, being a baby Christian at 29, 30 years old. But I did see the signs of some of what you referred to before that didn't quite add up to me. That there was a sense of cultural persecution that the church felt that I said, where is this coming from? However,
Right.
historically, one thing happened very early on. I wasn't even a Christian for a year when 9/11 happened. And whatever signs I was seeing that I was concerned about cultural division, one of the positive notes that I took was the way that the country came together. Even my dad was saying, thank goodness George W. Bush is president. My dad, who's left liberal,
Yeah.
I the in within about 10 minutes max after I saw what was happening on January 6th, I said, we're a very different country now. There is nothing that's going to break this fever. Because I was listening to, I think it was Hannity on the radio, or maybe it was Wilkow, and they were already there were already talking points emerging that were either whitewashing what was actually happening, blaming it on, somehow it was, what do you call it? Oh, this is a setup kind of a thing. Or it was clear to me that if 9/11 happened on January 6, 2021, there'd be some people that were rooting for the planes to crash into the towers.
I mean, look what's happening with MAGA backing Russia.
Yeah, exactly.
It's insane. It's insane. And I said this to a lot of people. If you have 9/11 now, does the whole Congress join together and sing God Bless America on the Capitol steps?
I don't think so.
Immediately you would have 5 to 10 members of Congress going on Twitter and blaming the other side, which would then trigger everybody else to pile on and take side. It would be an absolute nightmare, a mess. Don't think for a moment that our enemies don't know all this.
Right.
They're absolutely. But you said something interesting, about becoming a Christian, 25 years ago. When I look back on on Christian political participation in an earlier era of my life, because I was a member of the conservative legal movement. I was Christian conservative Republican for most of my adult life. And I look back and reflect on the power of leadership, because if you're talking about a George W. Bush figure who's much more of a love your neighbor Christian, after all, love your neighbor Christians would do PEPFAR, which has saved an estimated 25 million lives.
Yeah.
It really, or that you have a Mitt Romney, love your neighbor, member of the LDS Church, right? When you have John McCain, who, although not really known for his faith, his faith life, absolutely known as a person in many ways of, integrity and compassion. And so when you have the political leadership is reflecting good values, then everybody in the coalition under it tends to conform to the leader.
Right.
This is the way I've put it when talking about leadership. Think of a leader as like setting the course of a river. And if you're in the institution, you're in the river. And you either go along with the current that is set by the leader, or you swim against it, which can exhaust you and you eventually get swept away. Or you have to, after a while, just swim to the side and get out because the current is very, very strong. And so when you had a George W. Bush, somebody who would do a PEPFAR, for example, somebody who advocated compassionate conservatism, who expanded Medicare, all of these things, then to conform to that ethos, to conform to the leader, means exhibiting some positive values. Switch the leader, like a Donald Trump, conforming to the leader means exhibiting vices.
Right.
It means exhibiting negative values. And so what ended up happening is for a lot of Christians, they were placed in a position where they had to choose between power and virtue. And with George W. Bush, they didn't have to make that tough choice. I'm not saying George W. Bush was perfect by any means. He's a human being. But as a general matter, he's a man of integrity. And so there wasn't that same stark choice. What Trump did is he put it right there to the white evangelical church: power, or integrity. And they went with power. They went with power. And so this is what happens where a lot of us, I mean, should be something that should humble us, because we often don't know who we truly are until our values are actually tested.
Right. So I wonder, gosh, we haven't even gotten to unwise, unethical, and unlawful, but I need to ask this one follow-up question. And that is, in order to break the fever, does it require a change in leadership? And if so, does what we've become as a culture, are we going to, is a leader able to emerge from what we've become as a culture that would help us break the fever?
Well, the short answer to that is yes.
Okay.
Because we have had terrible leaders in the past. Think of, for example, Woodrow Wilson,
Right.
resegregated the federal government, imprisoned political opponents. I mean, this is
Right.
a bad dude.
Yeah.
You consider Richard Nixon, the imperial presidency, attacking his political opponents. I mean, and who did we replace Richard Nixon with? Jimmy Carter, who was a Baptist Sunday school teacher.
Right.
Right. And he wasn't the president, I think, that we wanted him to be, which is why he lost to Reagan. But in a very short span of time, the United States of America turned the page on Richard Nixon and went with people who are very, very different. And so one of the things that you will see in American political history is if one approach fails, we'll take a different approach, sometimes the very opposite approach, almost instantly, almost immediately. And so there will be room for a person to stand up and say, this has been terrible. Now, what's interesting is America has this interesting pattern of shifting without repenting. They just sort of memory hole the bad moments.
Right.
So, when I was growing up as a young Republican in the early 1980s, that was not that far removed from Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
And yet I didn't meet any Republican who said, yeah, I was with Nixon.
Yeah.
But I know they were, right?
Right. Right.
You've seen this time and time again. People will just move on. They'll just move on. And so it's not like you have some sort of big moment of, well, we made a mistake. They'll just instead make a different choice. And I think that's what we should expect.
I almost welcome that, because I have this conversation with some other folks. Do you leave the off-ramp open?
Yeah.
And I want to leave that there are some folks who've crossed the line that, I always say, I don't want to give up on people, right? I always want to, whether it's the steps on the bus, come on the bus, there's plenty of room, you're the off-ramp open, and I don't want to give up on people. There are some folks who've crossed that line that I just, I hate to do it. I hate to click that unfriend button, but every once in a while, about once every 6 months, it happens. I can see, I embrace that possibility. I do want to ask you, though, you brought up a great paradigm on advisory opinions with Sarah Isger a few weeks ago. Sarah might put it in terms of buckets. The three buckets I just mentioned that you're looking at in terms of any number of actions the administration is taking include, should we ask that we need to ask the question, is it unwise? Is it unethical? Or is it unlawful? So I'd love for you to expound on these buckets, if you will,
Yeah.
and give us some examples of what might fall into each one.
Okay. So, yeah, I think that's a really good frame because not every bad decision by a president is illegal. And so, how do we distinguish? And so, for example, I look at it like this classic example of policy that is unwise. I think unwise is too mild, profoundly immoral,
Yeah,
um, foolish would be America switching sides to back Russia. That's not illegal. The president of the United States is the nation's chief diplomat. I mean, the
right.
secretary of state is his subordinate. And this is where the president has maybe the most power of all is in foreign affairs. And so Trump can switch. He can switch. Now, Congress can have something to say about that. But by and large, if a president wants to shift his diplomacy to where he's putting more pressure on Russia than Ukraine, he can do that. The fact that it's legal doesn't make it moral. The fact that it's legal doesn't make it wise. It's profoundly immoral. It's foolish. It's destructive to America's strategic interests. It's bad on multiple fronts, but it is not unconstitutional. Then unlawful would be, for example, a number of Trump policies that have already been enjoined by the courts. So, for example, when he wanted to change the definition of birthright citizenship or the meaning of birthright citizenship, that's blocked. There's a new policy that allowed immigration agents to enter houses of worship whenever they wanted to, blocked. There are a number of policies that have been blocked that are illegal. The best way to tell if it's illegal, what does a court say?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have kind of this category that I would say is unethical, if not illegal. And that would be, say, for example, firing the generals. He absolutely could fire the generals. But it's such a profound break with tradition and norms to fire generals who have not failed in combat or have not been insubordinate that what you're dealing with here is something that really looks much more unethical. Like it's not just unwise. It's breaching a norm, a value that has some moral force behind it. And I think that's, so I think those three categories are very helpful for describing our situation.
Well, what we've seen, the actions the administration has taken so far, some have indeed gone into the category of unlawful. And I'm curious how you see that already affecting the balance of power. So, for example, Congress has the power of the purse and oversight, which is largely ceded to
Useless.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, maybe contextualize it. If you could flesh out concrete ways that the balance of powers has already been disrupted.
Well, it is very, it's premature to say what's already disrupted. We can say with confidence what he's trying to disrupt.
Yeah.
So he's trying to place the presidency at the apex of American government, unquestioned apex. So when I say that, what he's trying to do is transform the constitutional order. And so if he can achieve key Supreme Court victories with his attempts to assert control over all federal employees and fire virtually anyone he wants to, if he can impound funds without consequence, if he can redefine birthright citizenship, all of these things, he will have successfully toppled the constitutional order, placed himself at the very apex of it. That's what he's trying to do right now. He has not yet succeeded in that. And how do you know he hasn't yet succeeded? Because if Democrats win Congress in 2026, they can block everything. They have a lot of power to stop Trump still. If Trump succeeds in a lot of these Supreme Court contests, or court contests, then even the Democrats taking power won't be sufficient to block him on a number of fronts. And so there's there is a difference between Congress voluntarily, because it's led by Mike Johnson and a lot of invertebrate Republicans who will not stand to Trump. There's a difference between Congress voluntarily ceding its power to the president,
Right.
which is what it's doing now, and a president taking power from not just this Congress, but all Congresses that follow.
Right.
That's what Trump is trying to do, and that's what he has not yet succeeded at. That's what these court challenges are all about.
Right. I'm curious to see if he does indeed ignore a court order, for example, which will give us a preview if the Democrats do take back the House. I'm not. I don't think the numbers are there for them to take back the Senate in 2026.
Yeah.
But if they do take back the House and they reasserted power of the purse and oversight, if Trump can do what he's threatening to do now with the judicial branch and say, "Oh yeah, that's cute that you just you assign these funds for this purpose, and yeah, we're just going to do what Elon tells us to do anyway."
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how that all plays out. Do you have any projections on how what you think is going to happen?
I think by and large Trump's going to lose at the Supreme Court, and I don't. The only thing I don't know is how much Trump will respect the decisions of the court. That's what I don't know. I am oddly enough, this might sound crazy, Corey, I'm very slightly inclined to be optimistic that he'll comply. Very slightly inclined to believe that. But I'm, for the first time in my life, I'm not certain about that. I'm not even slightly. When I say I'm slightly inclined, there's no confidence in that assertion at all.
Yeah.
I have no confidence that he'll comply. I'm slightly inclined to believe that he'll comply. But if the court does rule, and if he complies, then what we will have witnessed is a failed attempt at a constitutional revolution.
Okay.
And if it's a failed attempt, then elections will continue. The congressional elections will continue to matter a great deal. If he succeeds, then he really does change America now and in the future, and in ways Republicans, I guarantee you, will not like very soon, because all of that power that a Republican president will exercise now will then be handed to the next Democratic president.
Right.
And so the weird thing about the Trump movement right now is they are conducting their business as if they are never leaving power. Because if you think you might lose the next election, this is not a rational way to conduct the government.
Well,
by consolidating all power in the hands of a single person who's elected every 4 years.
the next logical question then is, do you have faith in the continued integrity of our elections, like what we saw in 2020? Secure elections, the integrity of individual state elections officials. Do you have faith that that's going to continue, or are you worried that those who are holding the levers of power, it's going to be a very different result?
I have faith in the design of our system, and here's what I mean. If the presidential election were one federally run election, I would have no faith in it at all.
Right.
Because I have no faith in MAGA to demonstrate an ounce of integrity at any point ever. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if MAGA, when I say MAGA, I mean the core-based Trump. There are a lot of Republicans who possess integrity. I don't know that I've ever met somebody who is purely MAGA, who I would say is also a person of integrity in the political sphere.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know anybody who's purely MAGA who's honest.
Oh, that's interesting.
Intellectually
honest or
honest.
Yeah.
Truthful.
That's a strong statement.
But note the qualification. I've never met somebody who's fully MAGA.
Okay.
Okay. I know lots of Republicans who are truthful and honest.
Sure.
Lots in my family, amongst my friends. I have not known somebody who's truly MAGA, like all in on it, who is, and when it comes to politics, honest. Now, I might believe them and trust them when they talk about like their family, or when they talk about things that are going on at church, or what their job or their profession. But in this category of politics, it's as if they've carved out a special exemption where the rules don't apply anymore. And we have to fight, 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 or we're going to lose to the left. And so, again, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about all Republicans, okay?
Yeah.
There are millions upon millions. One of my pinned tweets for a while was there are going to be good people who vote for Harris and good people who vote for Trump
Sure.
and good people who vote third party. And I stand by that. I know many, many good people who voted for Trump. But again, if somebody wants to dive all into MAGA in politics, I don't know a single person who's dived all the way into MAGA who remains honest.
Now that I think about it, I think that's fair. We've certainly seen it in our churches where, Dr. Moore talks about it all the time, where guys would rather set the whole Jesus thing aside if it doesn't line up with the requirements of the moment, the fighting for the moment. What's all that Jesus stuff, all that Sermon on the Mount stuff, that doesn't suit what's required of our times. I wanted to bring up a verse. I know it's one that's very close to your heart, but part of what I think is required in this moment is keeping a clear eye on true north, keeping a clear eye on our spiritual compass, on our intellectual compasses. And one for you is, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? So the floor is yours. What does this verse mean to you?
Yeah, I love this verse, and I'm not somebody who normally is like, this one verse tells the tale. There's a term for this called proof texting, where
Right.
you take a verse, yank it out of context, and then pin too much on it. But this one's a little different. Not just because the preface, what does the Lord require of you, O man, what is good?
Yeah.
Which is a pretty bold declaration that when you hear that, you're going to automatically say, I need to hear what comes next. Like this is a big declaration is about to come. But also when you read it, those three elements, justice, mercy, humility, or justice, kindness, humility, depending on the version.
The translation. Yeah.
Those values are resonant throughout all of Scripture. So it's a verse very similar to sort of like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's like one of these concise summary verses of the overall ethos.
Right.
And what I love about it is it just clearly says that yes, we are concerned with justice, but in our zeal for justice, we cannot forget humility and we cannot forget kindness. And in fact, those three values are listed co-equally. They're not in a sort of a descending order of descending importance. It's a this, and a this.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are pursuing justice in a way that is not merciful or kind, or if you're so confident in the rightness of your views that you lack humility, then you are wrong. You are failing in this obligation. And so it's a great shorthand way of sort of evaluating a person's approach to politics. Are they so into being kind and humble that they never pursue justice? That's a problem. Like the dedication to be like the nicest person in the room so that you never ruffle any feathers. If that allows injustice to continue, like there were a lot of very nice Christians in the South who did not raise a finger to stop Jim Crow, for example.
Right.
You can't do that. You cannot abandon justice for the sake of kindness. And your humility can't paralyze you to the point where you can't recognize injustice when it's plain before you. But at the same time, if you switch over and you pursue justice, in your zeal, you can't take an ends justifies the means perspective. And if anyone wants to know what a political model is for this, it would be the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. No one would accuse them of being squishy in their approach to justice.
Right.
But at the same time, the philosophy of nonviolence involved an immense amount of kindness
and humility
directed towards horrible people who do horrible things. And so people who say, well, that approach, David, will never work. Well, tell that to the civil rights movement.
Right. And, it just occurred to me, I know another one of your favorite sentences in the English language is the First Amendment. And it occurs to me that the First Amendment reflects this intricate balance between justice, kindness, and humility, the five freedoms that are articulated there.
Yeah, one of the wonderful things about not just the First Amendment, but the sort of philosophy of the American founding. I'll never be one of these people who say that classical liberalism is the Christian form of government. I Christians have lived and thrived under many different kinds of government. I just don't want to be in that position of saying that there is one form of government that is the most Christian form of government. But I will say that the American classical liberal founding is rooted in some profound truths that are quite consistent with Scripture. And there are two in particular. One, every human being is created in the image of God and worthy of being treated with dignity and respect. That is right there in we're all endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, right? So you can see that. And then the other profound truth, which permeates through the American founding, is that we're all also deeply flawed. So what classical liberalism tries to do and our founding tries to do is harmonize those two things. How do you create a government that acknowledges the dignity of every person and also acknowledge that we're all flawed? And how do you do that? You do that by protecting every single person's liberty and personal autonomy and integrity, and also create a system of checks and balances and restraints on power that prevent any flawed person from exercising too much authority.
Right, right. How are you doing on time, by the way? I have a couple more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time.
Let's go. I mean, 10 more minutes or so.
Sure.
Can we do
Yeah,
that?
that's perfect. Well, in that case, I definitely want to ask you about the after party. Last time we spoke, there were some high profile instances of certain churches having an absolute fit over the notion of, I don't know, being able to relate to each other across political
Yeah, yeah,
differences.
yeah.
Crazy idea. But overall, how has the work of the after party been going? Because the work continues.
Oh, absolutely. Because the after party is not tied to any particular election. And for those listeners who don't know, Curtis Chang, Russell Moore, and I created a curriculum for Christian political engagement that are centered around Micah 6:8 and basically takes the position that, look, a lot of Christian political engagement has focused more on policy than conduct. But the Bible focuses more on conduct than policy. So, for example, you cannot open the New Testament and learn how much aid we should supply to Ukraine, or how open should our border be, or what should our tax rate be, or there are just countless policy issues that divide us. That there's not a clear scriptural indication one way or the other. And most Christian political curriculum has really focused around policy. It's here is what the Christian political policy platform should be. But that's where the New Testament is at its most opaque. In reality, both Old and New Testament are very crystal clear about how we're to love our neighbor and how to treat our neighbor. And so what we've done is sort of said, for the sake of policies, I'm going to mistreat my neighbor. Well, Scripture doesn't permit that. Scripture doesn't sanction that. And so what we did with the after party is say, no, 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 no. Micah 6:8 says you cannot separate out your conduct from your policy. And so how do we treat each other? How do we live as people in full? And politics means exhibiting kindness, means exhibiting fruit of the Spirit. And so we're really trying to recenter the discussion away from what policies should Christians advocate, which is very, very debatable, to which values should Christians exhibit, which is very, very, very clearly stated in Scripture. And so that's why it's relevant, and it continues to be relevant. And in many ways, it's growing more relevant every day.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have sort of a sub question about the after party. I had two very different experiences when I told a couple different pastor friends of mine. One is my pastor at the church I go to in Pasadena, and Knox Press and Glendale Press ended up running with the materials and really dove into the resources. But the other one was the church I started out at. The fundamentalist church, more fundamentalist church. And one of the immediate reactions I got was, oh, that's David French's thing. Oh, yeah, we could never do that. So I was curious, like, how did your name, and people who don't even know you or your work or your life's work, or, how did your name become such a litmus test for some churches? I don't understand.
Character assassination. So the way this works is MAGA ran a con on American Christians. And the con was this. They essentially said to American Christians that you cannot be pro-life and for religious liberty and hold values X, Y, and Z unless you vote for Donald Trump. Okay. And so one of the reasons why Russell Moore and me and Tim Keller, while he was alive, became such lightning rods is we were living examples of the contrary. So we were not supporting Trump and we were pro-life. We were not supporting Trump and we supported religious liberty. We're not supporting Trump and we held to a lot of constitutional values. And so you're a living example of an alternative path. Well, and now go back into friend-enemy distinction morality that we talked on early.
Right.
The fact that I am a Christian who pursues a different political path in this world where politics is religion made me an enemy. I'm no longer a friend, even though I believe in all this creeds and confessions of the church, even though I have strong conservative political positions that continue to this day. I become enemy because I am not with the Trump movement. And so when you become an enemy in the Trump movement, they engage in threats, intimidation, and very critically, character assassination. And so there has been a flood of character assassination against me, against Russell, and others, to the point where there are lots and lots of Christians who believe completely fictional things about me, about Russell. And so when our name comes up in church, even pastors who might be sympathetic sometimes recoil because some of the MAGA members will say, he's a heretic, he's a wolf, he's not a real Christian, etc. And they'll engage in that character assassination, create confusion and division in the church. And people just don't want that. That's in a nutshell what happened with the PCA. When the PCA invited me to speak, there were a group of people who engaged in gross character assassination. I mean, gross, Corey. Yeah. And the folks in the pews, or the folks who are leading the denomination, who don't like live in this world, just recoiled from the conflict. Right. And so they capitulated to the character assassination. And this is just happening all over. And so, recently not that recently, a couple of years ago, I was talking on Capitol Hill, and a woman from a conservative think tank came up to me and said, I'd like to talk to you about your position on trans issues. And she was very angry at me. Okay. And I said, well, before we start, what is my position? And she told me, and it was complete fiction. And I said, that's not true at all. Where did you get that? Well, something like, I can't remember, something like I follow Matt Walsh on Twitter. Yeah. Like, hey, I write my own stuff. Like, you can read what I've actually written. And it's not what you just said. Right. And so it's that character assassination that MAGA engages in. And that once that character assassination locks in, you become a controversial, quote, controversial person in Christian circles. And a lot of pastors are allergic to controversy for a lot of understandable reasons. And so if they have a choice, say, between bringing in speaker A, who the MAGA wing of their congregation is not going to object to, or speaker B, who the MAGA wing of the congregation, influenced by character assassination, is going to freak out over, well, then you're going to go with A over B. Yeah. And so this kind of pattern is being repeated. And it is a product of the most ugly character assassination.
So that leads to my second to last question, which is our TP&R question. I've asked you this before, but I'm curious how you might answer it differently now. And that is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news and analysis from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Well, remember how I said earlier, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, that people are not friend-enemy. We're complicated. Yeah. It's more like a series of intersecting Venn diagrams than it is two separate circles, right? And so one of the things that I like to do when I meet people is dive into the overlap in the Venn diagram to begin with, rather than diving into the part of the Venn diagram where we diverge. And by diving into the part of the Venn diagram where we overlap, even if it's something relatively, well, I I'll get my Southern card revoked if I say this, but relatively insignificant, like college football,
Okay.
um, which I love. Like I love college football, but it's not as significant as like the Ukraine war, right?
Right, right.
And so, even if you're leaning into something that feels relatively insignificant as a point of connection, lean into it.
Yeah.
Lean into it. Because what that will do right off the front is it will humanize you to them and them to you. And
Oh,
so
yeah, that makes sense.
if you lean into the division right away, you never get to the humanizing stage. So if you lean into the commonality, and then eventually when you do get to the division, I'm not going to say it makes it all fine. It makes it more likely the discussion you can have it in a civil and reasonable way where you reach each other's hearts and minds.
That's a really good point. I entered into a conversation about Ukraine the other day with a friend who's he still wears his, MAGA hat, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you clean up on aisle 46 hat every day. But I started with, here's where I can be persuaded about is part of your position when it comes to Ukraine. It was right after the EU meeting. Um, anyway, but I quickly pivoted to where we disagree. I think I might have leaned into some points where I could have been persuaded, or some points where, at least in principle, and our goals are the same, given that answer. So that makes a ton of sense. I appreciate that. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, I am curious. You've been doing this podcast for a while. You're trying to get people to talk without killing each other.
Yeah.
Um, obviously, as our we're remaining extremely polarized. We seem to be getting more polarized. How hopeful are you about the project that you've been engaged in? Doesn't mean even if we're not succeeding and trying to, you know, bring a greater degree of humility and mercy into our politics, the fight is still worth it. You still pursue virtue, even if even if you think that the pursuit of virtue will fail, you still pursue it. But I'm very curious, how do you keep going when it seems as if our shared enterprise of trying to get people to talk politics without hating each other and devolving into dishonesty and character assassination, how are you still going?
The the first answer that comes to mind, I'm still Jewish. At my core, I'm still Jewish. So I can only answer you the most Jewish way possible, and that is, it depends. So it depends how wide of a lens we're using. If we're using the widest lens and looking at things as a country, I'm pretty pessimistic. At least in the short, near, and midterm, I'm pretty pessimistic about the direction of things. But if we take a close-up lens, if I'm talking to my buddy at the local, if I'm talking to a friend at this town's business group, or any one of the charity fundraisers that our town puts on a monthly basis, to my neighbor, somebody I run into on when I'm walking the dog, I'm much more optimistic. Because if we focus on the personal, we can then focus on the relational, and the human, to your point, the humanity and the complexity of that person and that person's story. Whereas if we're looking at the national and we only encounter people when an issue arises and they're hopping into a conversation because, overnight they've become an expert. Just last month, I had somebody hop in on a conversation about what's happening in my home. The California fires were raging. And how did this guy who's never left the state of New Jersey become an expert overnight on California fire policy?
Yeah.
That could be very discouraging. But when I focus on my family and people I disagree with within my family, when I focus on my neighbor or folks around town that I'm dear friends with, then maybe it's just because I'm really endeavoring to get better at it myself, to have these more nurturing, nourishing conversations myself, as opposed to reverting to a default posture of contentiousness, and trying to win some imaginary contest or debate every time, and focusing on the relational. So Yeah, it depends. That's the
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I have much the same experience. When you do focus on the personal, you can actually have a lot of real and meaningful conversations. What gets really sad though is when you're having a lovely conversation with somebody on the personal and it shifts political and it gets ugly
mm,
fast,
real fast.
um, very fast. And that's when I go back, circle back to the deep MAGA, the distinction between like a Republican and somebody who's deep MAGA. When I've encountered people who are deep MAGA, when the conversation shifts political, it gets ugly really fast. And that's what's very, very sad. That those are the people who are driving the atmosphere of intimidation, slander, threats that you see on the right. Now, I know there's left-wing analogs to this, no
Sure.
question.
Yeah.
There's a phrase that was commonly used several years ago called the dirtbag left. Um, that is a real that like they've earned it, right? They've earned it.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that a lot of this sort of dishonesty is exclusively a right-wing phenomenon. I think it is inherent in many forms of extremism,
Yeah. Yeah.
and MAGA at its core is an extremist movement in many ways.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, and that makes sense too. One of the things I've learned is that at the end of the day, I still have my limitations.
Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly what that line is, um, but when somebody accuses me of being anti-Semitic because I didn't vote for Trump, and I clearly don't support Israel, like there's a line somewhere, but that's over the line. I don't think we're going to have a fruitful conversation if that's the
Yeah.
starting point.
Yeah.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's so nice to see you, and tell Nancy we send our love. We're all rooting for her.
Yeah. Thank you. Will
She's the
do.
best. Before we go, I love following your work, and you're pretty prolific in the potosphere. But also, how can folks follow your writing and all the great work
Yeah.
that you're doing?
Just follow me at go to the New York Times. I write twice a week minimum there, and you can follow me on Twitter, on Blue Sky, on Threads. I tend to spend more time on Blue Sky and Twitter than Threads because Threads is much more pop culture oriented, and although I
Okay.
love pop culture, people are just less interested in politics over there. So
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
which might make it healthier, but because I write about politics a lot, then yeah. But follow me on social media. That's the easiest way to keep up with my work.
Terrific. Thanks again for doing this, David. It's great to see you, and thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I appreciate it.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review. We really can use some more reviews. And now you can watch these conversations on YouTube and support us on Patreon. It's youtube.com/at politics and religion and patreon.com/politics and religion. Your support really does make a difference. So thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect. And have a great week.